A judge, Otanes, walks toward his official chair to begin the day's proceedings in the Persian court. The chair is ornate, heavy, and new, but the material it is upholstered with is strangely familiar, its leathery texture still bearing the faint, horrifying outline of a human form. It is the freshly flayed, tanned skin of his own father, Schisms. This is not a scene from a nightmare. This was a deliberate act of state policy ordered in the 6th century BC by King Cambyses II. The son was commanded to sit on his father's remains every day as he dispensed justice, a constant, tactile reminder of the consequence of failure. What crime could possibly justify a punishment so grotesque, so meticulously cruel? And what does it tell us about the nature of power that a civilization would weaponize human flesh as a permanent tool of government? This is not merely a story of a barbaric execution. It is a chilling exploration into the psychology of absolute authority, the theater of terror, and the dark, enduring impulse to make an example of an enemy. To understand the punishment, one must first understand the man who ordered it. Cambyses II was the son of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, a ruler remembered for his tolerance. Cambyses was different. He inherited an empire, but he ruled it with a paranoid iron grip. The Greek historian Herodotus would later paint him as a despot, a madman who desecrated Egyptian temples and murdered his own family, while Herodotus's accounts are likely colored by political propaganda. They point to a core truth. Cambyses' world was one of absolute control. The empire was held together not just by armies, but by the sacred, unassailable authority of the king's law. Any threat to that law was a threat to the empire itself. Into this crucible stepped the judge, Schisms. He was a man entrusted with the highest legal authority, a direct representative of the king's justice, and he was corrupt. Schisms accepted a bribe, and in doing so, delivered a judgment that favored wealth over truth. For Cambyses, this was not simply corruption. It was not theft. It was a profound act of treason. It was a sickness in the heart of the empire, a personal betrayal of the king's divine mandate. The punishment, therefore, could not be a simple, quiet execution. It had to be a statement. It had to be a lesson etched, not just in memory, but in flesh. Schisms was arrested and brought to a public square. He was to be flayed alive. This was not a frenzied, chaotic act of butchery. It was a cold, precise, and agonizingly slow procedure. The executioners were often skilled artisans of torment. The process would begin with incisions around the extremities, the ankles, the wrists, the face. The goal was not to kill, but to deconstruct the living man. The primary tool was the knife. With surgical precision, the executioners would peel the skin from the underlying muscle and tissue. Working in long, careful strips, they were trained to avoid the major arteries. A quick death from blood loss would defeat the entire purpose of the ordeal. The victim was to remain conscious, to feel, and to be seen. Death would come eventually, but as a slow release. The victim would succumb to a combination of hypovolemic shock from fluid loss, a rapid drop in body temperature as the body's primary insulation was removed, and the overwhelming, excruciating pain. But this process could take many hours, sometimes even days. The public was made to watch. The screams were not an unfortunate side effect. They were a central component of the spectacle. Why this specific, horrific method? To list acts of cruelty is simple. To understand the cold logic behind them reveals the true nature of power. The first layer of analysis is the most obvious, the theater of terror. Flaying was never for the victim. It was for the audience. A beheading is swift, a demonstration of the state's power over life and death. But a public flaying is a demonstration of its power over suffering. It bypasses the rational mind and installs a deep, visceral, animalistic fear. It communicates to every onlooker that the state's wrath is not just lethal, but patient, meticulous, and absolute. It is psychological warfare, and the victim's body is the banner. The second layer is metaphysical, the act of annihilation. In the ancient world, the skin was not just a biological envelope. It was the boundary of the self, the canvas of identity. To strip a man of his skin was seen as stripping him of his honor, his humanity, and his very place in the world. It was a symbolic erasure. For many cultures, a body mutilated in this way could never find peace in the afterlife. It was a damnation on earth and a curse for eternity. The third and most chilling layer is that of statecraft. The punishment did not end with the victim's death. The skin itself became a state asset. This is where Cambyses' order transcends mere cruelty and becomes a dark form of political genius. He ordered the flayed skin of schisms to be carefully tanned, preserving it against decay. It was then stretched and upholstered onto the very chair from which the corrupt judge had passed his false sentence. And then came the masterstroke. Cambyses appointed Schism's own son, Otanes, as the new judge, and commanded him to sit in that chair. Imagine the daily reality for Otanes. Every morning he would enter the court and be confronted with this grotesque monument to his father's failure. He would be forced to feel the very skin of his predecessor, his own flesh and blood, beneath him as he dispensed the law. It was a tactile, permanent, inescapable warning. The law was not an abstract concept. It was a physical presence rooted in blood and agony. Cambyses had created a literal, physical policy document, a throne of justice that was also a monument to its own violation. The Persians, for all their chilling precision, were not the inventors of this practice. To find its true origins as a systematic tool of empire, we must travel to the brutal, militaristic world of the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Near East centuries earlier, was arguably one of the most ruthless military machines in history. For them, flaying was not an anomaly. It was standard imperial procedure. It was a recorded, celebrated, and advertised method for dealing with rebellious leaders in defiant cities. They did not hide their actions. They carved them in stone. The palace reliefs from the capital of Nineveh are not just art, they are propaganda. They depict in graphic detail the fate of enemies. King Ashurnasirpal II, a contemporary of the 9th century BC, boasted of his cruelty in inscriptions, "I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins, ... I built a pillar over against his city gate, and I flayed all the chiefs, and I covered the pillar with their skins." When the Assyrian army conquered a city, the skins of its former leaders were nailed to the city gates, left to rot in the sun. Every person entering or leaving that city, every merchant, every child, every citizen, was forced to walk past this gallery of horrors. The message was unambiguous. This is the price of resistance. This is what happens to those who defy the empire. This use of human skin as a political tool appears across cultures, though sometimes with starkly different meanings in Mesoamerica. The Aztecs practiced a form of ritual flaying, but in a context that is, to the modern mind, even more alien. It was not for punishment, but for religion. The rites of the god Zip-Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, involved a chosen victim being flayed. A priest would then wear the victim's skin for a period of 20 days. This was not an act of terror, but a profound and gruesome fertility ritual. The priest, wearing the flayed skin, symbolized the dead husk of the dry season, from which new vegetation, the new life of the corn, would eventually break forth. Here, the flayed skin was a symbol of renewal and rebirth in Ming Dynasty China. The practice returned to the realm of punishment. The Hongwu Emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, was a brilliant but deeply paranoid ruler who launched massive purges against his own bureaucracy. He is said to have reinstated bopai, or flaying, as a punishment for corrupt officials. According to some accounts, skins of these officials were stuffed with straw and hung in their old offices, a warning to their replacements. Even in medieval Europe, the practice lingered, both in reality and in powerful legend. The apostle Saint Bartholomew was, according to tradition, flayed alive in Armenia. In the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo painted him holding his own flayed skin, a symbol of his martyrdom. More tangibly, at the Copford Church in Essex, England, fragments of skin were found nailed to the 11th century door. Legend held it was a Danish Viking, punished for sacrilege. In 2001, DNA analysis confirmed the skin was indeed human, most likely from the 9th or 10th century, a silent testament that this horrific practice was not confined to distant, barbaric empires. Given its long and widespread history, why did this practice eventually disappear? It was not, as we might hope, a sudden global awakening of mercy or compassion. The decline of flaying was a matter of practical governance and changing philosophy. By the late medieval and early modern periods, European states were centralizing. Justice, to be effective, needed to be standardized, not just spectacular. The raw, passionate, and deeply personal cruelty of flaying began to be replaced by more efficient and impersonal methods. The gallows, the beheading block, and later the firing squad were symbols of an organized, rational state enforcing a codified law. Flaying, by contrast, was messy. It was chaotic. It risked making the ruler appear less like a divine king and more like a savage butcher. Then came the Enlightenment. In the 18th century, thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, in his revolutionary work on crimes and punishments, argued that the purpose of punishment was not to inflict spectacular torment, but to be proportionate and to deter crime. The state's power, he argued, should be rational. It's not based on terror. This philosophical shift, combined with the rise of new methods of control, spelled the end for flaying. The modern era would invent its own horrors: the impersonal efficiency of the gas chamber, the psychological erasure of the gulag, but the raw hands-on spectacle of flaying was left behind. The power of the state shifted from torturing the body to disciplining the soul. As the prison and the asylum replaced the public scaffold, the last recorded cases flicker out in the 17th and 18th centuries, fading from legal code into the realm of dark legend and historical horror. The chair of schisms is gone. The skins on the walls of Nineveh have turned to dust. But the impulse behind them remains. The desire to not just defeat an enemy, but to annihilate, dehumanize, and make a terrifying example of them is a dark thread that runs through human history. Flaying was simply one of its most visceral and honest expressions. It was the terrifying, logical extension of absolute power, the assertion that the state, in its wrath, could own its subjects completely, body and skin.